The radio crackled to life just as Ranger James Mitchell lifted his coffee cup to his lips, the metallic voice cutting through Yellowstone's morning silence like a blade. Code red at mile marker 47. Large predator in distress. Immediate assistance required. The cup slipped from his fingers, hot coffee splashing across the dashboard as his truck lurched forward. What he found wasn't what dispatch had described. A massive female grizzly lay motionless on the asphalt, her 350-pound frame wrapped in the crushing coils of an 18-foot Burmese python, a species that had no business being in Wyoming's wilderness. Then the forest exploded behind him. A 600-pound male grizzly burst from the tree line, his roar shaking the ground as he launched himself at the serpent with a fury that defied nature's laws. This wasn't territorial aggression or feeding behavior. This was something far more dangerous and beautiful. As James grabbed his radio with trembling hands, one question burned in his mind. What kind of love drives a wild animal to face certain death? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. The western boundary of Yellowstone had always been James Mitchell's sanctuary, a place where the weight of widowhood felt lighter beneath towering pines and endless sky. At 52, the head ranger carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who'd learned that life's hardest lessons often came without warning. 3 years had passed since cancer took his wife Sarah, leaving him to raise their teenage daughter Emma alone while finding solace in protecting the wilderness she'd loved. This morning felt different. The late June air hung thick with humidity, and reports of unusual animal behavior had been trickling in for weeks. Poachers, smugglers, and the kind of desperate people who saw dollar signs in endangered species had been testing the park's boundaries more frequently. James had seen it all in his 25 years of service, but nothing could have prepared him for what lay ahead on that remote stretch of road. Magnus had roamed these mountains for 8 years, a solitary giant whose massive frame and distinctive silver-tipped fur made him a legend among park staff. Orphaned at 6 months when poachers killed his mother for her gallbladder, he'd survived through intelligence and caution that bordered on the supernatural. Most grizzlies avoided human contact, but Magnus seemed to understand the difference between friend and foe in ways that defied explanation. Luna represented everything gentle in the wilderness. Smaller than most females at 350 pounds, she possessed an unusual trust in the world around her. Wildlife photographer had captured her playing in mountain streams, her cinnamon-colored coat gleaming in dappled sunlight. When she and Magnus had paired 2 springs ago, even the most hardened rangers found themselves smiling at their unlikely courtship, beauty and the beast finding each other in an unforgiving landscape. Doctor. Sarah Chan had dedicated 30 years to wildlife medicine, building Yellowstone's rescue program from nothing into a model for the nation. At 55, she carried the quiet ache of a woman who'd chosen career over family, watching countless animal mothers with their young while her own maternal instincts remained unfulfilled. Her expertise with large predators was unmatched, but lately she found herself wondering if healing animals could fill the hollow space where her own children might have been. Eleanor Whitman had been volunteering at the Wildlife Center for a decade, ever since her husband Frank passed and left her rattling around in a house too big for one person. At 72, she possessed the kind of fierce tenderness that only comes from surviving great loss. Frank had been a ranger himself, and she'd learned to read animal behavior almost as well as he had. Her grown children lived on distant coasts, busy with their own lives, leaving her to find family among the creatures that couldn't abandon her. None of them knew that former Ranger Vincent Torres was watching from the shadows, his weathered hands gripping binoculars as he tracked the movements of the most valuable bears in North America. His 10-year-old daughter Maria lay in a Denver hospital, her leukemia treatment draining his savings faster than mountain snow in summer. The man who'd once sworn to protect these animals now faced an impossible choice between his conscience and his child's life. The morning had started like any other for James Mitchell. Coffee at dawn, radio check with dispatch, and the familiar rumble of his Ranger truck winding through Yellowstone's western corridors. He'd been thinking about Emma's college applications when the emergency call shattered his routine. Possible injured animal near Flat Ridge Pass, the dispatcher had said. Could be a moose, maybe something bigger. Nothing could have prepared him for the scene that unfolded as his truck crested the hill. There, sprawled across the narrow asphalt road, was a sight that defied belief. Luna, the gentle female grizzly he'd observed for years, lay motionless beneath the crushing coils of a massive snake. The python, easily 18 feet long and thick as a telephone pole, had wrapped itself around her midsection with deadly precision, its dull scales gleaming in the morning light. James's hands trembled as he reached for his radio, but before he could speak, the forest erupted behind him. Magnus burst from the tree line like a force of nature unleashed, his 600-pound frame moving with surprising grace despite his size. The sound that escaped his throat wasn't the typical vocalization of a territorial male. It was primal, desperate, filled with an anguish that transcended species. The battle was swift and brutal. Magnus slammed into the python with the force of a freight train, his massive claws raking across the serpent's body as it instinctively tightened its grip on Luna. Blood sprayed across the asphalt as the python whipped its head around, striking at Magnus's shoulder and drawing crimson streaks across his silver-tipped fur. But the great bear didn't retreat. Instead, he positioned himself strategically, using his weight and strength to pull at the coils while avoiding the snake's fangs. James found himself frozen, witnessing something that would haunt and inspire him for the rest of his life. This wasn't the behavior of a wild animal acting on instinct. This was conscious sacrifice, a deliberate choice to risk everything for another. Magnus's dark eyes never left Luna's face, even as the python's tail lashed across his hindquarters, opening deep gashes that would later require dozens of stitches. The python, realizing it was outmatched, finally released its grip and began to retreat into the underbrush. But Magnus wasn't finished. He pursued the serpent for several yards, ensuring it was truly gone before returning to Luna's still form. Only then did James notice the bear's injuries, deep puncture wounds from the python's teeth, claw marks where the massive coils had squeezed, and a gash above his left eye that sent blood streaming down his face. Luna wasn't moving. Her breathing was shallow, labored, and James could see the beginning of bruising where the python had constricted around her ribs. Magnus approached her carefully, his massive head lowering to gently nuzzle her neck. The sound he made, a low, questioning whimper, was heartbreaking in its vulnerability. James radioed for immediate backup, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Emergency wildlife rescue needed at mile marker 47. Female grizzly, critical condition. Male present but non-aggressive. Repeat, non-aggressive. He'd dealt with enough injured bears to know that males typically became dangerous when their mates were threatened, but Magnus seemed to understand that humans represented help, not harm. Doctor. Sarah Chen arrived within 30 minutes, her emergency response team right behind her. She'd been preparing for surgery on an injured elk when James's call came through, but the urgency in his voice had sent her racing across the park. What she found challenged everything she thought she knew about grizzly behavior. Magnus had positioned himself as a sentinel beside Luna, close enough to protect her, but far enough away to allow the medical team access. His dark eyes tracked every movement, every piece of equipment, but he made no aggressive gestures. When Dr. Chen approached with her medical bag, he actually stepped back slightly, an unprecedented display of trust from a wild grizzly. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Chen whispered to James as she began her initial examination. Luna's pulse was weak but steady, her breathing shallow. The constriction marks around her torso were severe, suggesting possible internal injuries that would require immediate intervention. The transport to the Wildlife Medical Center became a logistical challenge, unlike any they'd faced. Magnus refused to leave Luna's side, following the stretcher to the emergency vehicle and attempting to climb into the back. After several tense minutes, Dr. Chen made a decision that would later spark national debate. She allowed Magnus to ride with Luna, his massive frame curled protectively around her unconscious form. As the convoy made its way through the winding mountain roads, James found himself thinking about his late wife and the kind of love that doesn't calculate cost. In his rearview mirror, he could see Magnus's vigilant silhouette, never taking his eyes off Luna's face. Whatever happened next, he knew he'd witnessed something rare and sacred, a love story that would challenge everyone's understanding of what it means to be devoted to another soul. The Yellowstone Wildlife Medical Center had never faced a situation quite like this. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the emergency bay, watching as Magnus refused to move more than 6 feet from Luna's examination table. Every time a staff member approached with medical equipment, his massive head would lift, dark eyes tracking their movements with an intelligence that bordered on unsettling. He wasn't aggressive, simply watchful, as if he understood that these humans held his mate's life in their hands. "Her vitals are stabilizing, but I'm concerned about internal bleeding," Dr. Chen announced to the gathered team. Luna's breathing had improved during the transport, but the constriction marks around her torso told a story of trauma that couldn't be seen from the surface. "We need to get her into surgery within the next few hours, or we could lose her." James Mitchell stood at the observation window, his radio crackling with updates from park headquarters. News of the rescue was already spreading, and he could see the first television van pulling into the center's parking lot. "Doc, we've got media attention coming fast. This story's about to go national." The first major crisis came at 2 p.m. when Luna's condition suddenly deteriorated. Her blood pressure dropped dramatically, and Dr. Chen's worst fears were confirmed: internal bleeding from the python's crushing grip. Emergency surgery was the only option, but it would require separating Magnus from Luna for the first time since the attack. "We have to move her now," Dr. Chen announced, her voice tight with urgency. "Every minute we wait increases the risk of losing her." But Magnus had other plans. As the surgical team wheeled Luna toward the operating room, the massive grizzly rose to his full height and positioned himself directly in their path. His posture wasn't threatening, it was pleading. A low, mournful sound escaped his throat, a vocalization that none of the staff had heard from a grizzly before. "He knows," whispered Eleanor Whitman, who had arrived an hour earlier after hearing about the emergency on her police scanner. At 72, she'd seen enough animal behavior to recognize grief and desperation when she saw it. "He knows she might not wake up." Dr. Chen found herself in an impossible position. Every moment of delay put Luna's life at greater risk, but attempting to forcibly separate Magnus could result in a dangerous confrontation. That's when she noticed something that stopped her cold: a distinctive scar pattern on Magnus's left shoulder, 3 parallel lines that she recognized from a case 12 years earlier. "My God," she breathed, stepping closer despite the potential danger. "Magnus, is that really you?" The great bear's head tilted at the sound of his name, and Dr. Chen felt her throat tighten with emotion. She had treated his mother when he was just a 6-month-old cub, working desperately to save the female grizzly from poachers' bullets. She'd failed that day, watching helplessly as the mother bear died while her frightened cub huddled in the corner of the examination room. "You remember me, don't you?" she said softly, extending her hand slowly. To everyone's amazement, Magnus stepped forward and allowed her to touch his massive head. "I couldn't save your mother, but I'm going to save Luna. I promise you that." The moment of recognition seemed to break something loose in Magnus. He moved aside, allowing the surgical team to pass, but his eyes never left Dr. Chen's face. In that exchange, something deeper than professional duty took hold of her. A maternal instinct she'd buried for years suddenly roared to life. As Luna disappeared into the operating room, Magnus settled into what would become his vigil position, lying on the floor outside the surgical suite, his massive frame blocking the hallway but never threatening staff movement. Eleanor approached slowly, her weathered hands carrying a thermos of coffee for the medical team. "I've seen this before," she told James quietly. "My husband Frank, he was a ranger for 35 years. He once told me about a bear couple that got separated during a forest fire. The male walked 200 miles to find his mate. Took him 3 months. When Frank found them, they were lying together in a meadow, the female near death from her burns. The male had been bringing her food and water for weeks." The financial reality of Luna's situation hit the center like a thunderbolt when the initial surgery estimates came in. $50,000 for the emergency procedure, with additional costs for recovery and ongoing care. The center's insurance didn't cover exotic animal attacks, and their emergency fund had been depleted by a summer of wildfire rescues. "We can't afford this," admitted Center Director Mark Thompson, his voice heavy with defeat. "The board will never approve this kind of expenditure for 2 bears, not when we're already running a deficit." Eleanor Whitman had been listening from the hallway, and something in his words triggered a memory of her husband's voice. "Sometimes doing what's right costs more than you have, but that doesn't make it less right." Without hesitation, she pulled out her cell phone and called her bank. "I want to mortgage my house," she said simply when the loan officer answered, "Yes, all of it, today." By evening, the story had exploded across social media. Videos of Magnus's rescue of Luna, followed by footage of his hospital vigil, garnered millions of views. The hashtag #MagnusAndLuna began trending nationally, with people sharing their own stories of animal devotion and human love. Donations started flowing in through the center's website, $5 here, $50 there, but building into something substantial. But with the attention came controversy. Critics questioned spending tens of thousands on animal care when homeless veterans needed help, when children went hungry, when human medical needs went unmet. The debate raged on talk shows and social media, splitting communities and families over a fundamental question. How much was love worth? Luna's surgery stretched through the night, and Magnus never moved from his position outside the operating room doors. Dr. Sarah Chen emerged at 3 a.m., exhaustion etched across her face, to find the massive grizzly exactly where she'd left him 8 hours earlier. His dark eyes lifted to meet hers, and she saw a question there that needed no translation. "She's going to make it," Dr. Chen whispered, and something that looked remarkably like relief passed across Magnus's features. "But there's something else we discovered during the surgery. Luna is pregnant, about 6 weeks along, carrying twins." The news sent shockwaves through the small team of dedicated staff who had remained through the night. Eleanor Whitman pressed her hand to her heart, thinking of all the grandchildren she rarely saw, while James Mitchell found himself remembering Sarah's miscarriages, the children they'd never had a chance to hold. "This changes everything," said Mark Thompson, the center director, his voice heavy with the weight of new responsibility. "We're not just caring for 2 bears anymore, we're potentially preserving the next generation of Yellowstone grizzlies." As word of Luna's pregnancy spread, the national attention intensified. Morning talk shows debated the ethics of expensive wildlife care, while children in nearby communities lacked basic health care. Conservative commentators questioned government priorities, while animal rights activists rallied support for what they called a love story for the ages. Dr. Chen found herself at the center of a media storm she'd never wanted. As Luna began her slow recovery, reporters camped outside the medical center, hoping for interviews and updates. But her focus remained entirely on her patients, both the conscious and unconscious one. Magnus's behavior during Luna's recovery challenged every textbook definition of wild animal psychology. He learned the staff's routines within days, moving aside when medical personnel needed access, but always returning to his watchful position. When Luna was moved to a larger recovery room, he followed, somehow understanding that this proximity was permitted. "It's like he's reading our intentions," Dr. Chen confided to Eleanor during one of the older woman's daily visits. "Yesterday, I approached with Luna's medication, and he actually lifted his paw to give me better access to her IV port. A wild grizzly helping with medical treatment." Eleanor smiled, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "My Frank always said animals understand more than we give them credit for. They just don't waste time with words when actions speak clearer." The financial pressure continued mounting as Luna's care extended into its second week. The initial $50,000 had covered the emergency surgery, but ongoing treatment, medication, and specialized nutrition were draining resources at an alarming rate. Eleanor's house mortgage had provided a crucial buffer, but even that generous donation wouldn't last forever. Vincent Torres watched from the shadows of the forest surrounding the medical center, his binoculars focused on the recovery room windows. His daughter, Maria, had taken another turn for the worse, and the experimental treatment she needed cost $200,000, money he didn't have and insurance wouldn't cover. He'd tracked Magnus and Luna for months, knowing their value on the black market for exotic animal collectors. But seeing Magnus's devotion through those windows made his stomach turn with shame. On Luna's 10th day of recovery, she opened her eyes fully for the first time since the attack. Magnus was lying beside her enclosure, his massive head resting on his paws, when her soft chuff brought him instantly to attention. The reunion was gentle but profound, Magnus carefully pressing his snout against the fence while Luna nuzzled back, their vocalizations creating a private conversation that brought tears to watching staff members. "Look at that," whispered James, who had become a daily visitor despite his ranger duties. "She's telling him about the babies. I'd stake my career on it." Dr. Chen's professional demeanor cracked as she watched the interaction. Her own journey through failed fertility treatments came flooding back. The hope, the loss, the quiet grief that never fully healed. Seeing Luna's protective instincts awakening, as she instinctively guarded her pregnant belly, triggered something maternal in Dr. Chen that she'd thought was permanently buried. The ethical debates intensified as Luna's strength returned. Wildlife purists argued that keeping the bears in captivity, even temporarily, risked domesticating them beyond the point of safe release. Others contended that their unique bond made them ideal candidates for a breeding program that could help restore Yellowstone's grizzly population. "These aren't just any bears," argued Dr. Patricia Williams, a wildlife behaviorist who had flown in from Colorado to observe Magnus and Luna. Their demonstrated intelligence, their ability to cooperate with humans while maintaining their wild instincts, they could be the foundation for a new approach to conservation. But Magnus himself seemed to be making the decision for everyone. As Luna's health improved, his own condition began deteriorating. He'd lost nearly 60 pounds, his magnificent coat dulled from stress and inadequate nutrition. Despite the staff's best efforts to encourage him to eat, he would only consume enough to survive, his attention never wavering from Luna's needs. "He's dying of love," Eleanor observed during one particularly difficult evening when Magnus had refused food for the third consecutive day. "I've seen it in humans, when caring for someone else becomes more important than caring for yourself." Dr. Chen made a controversial decision on Luna's 15th day of recovery. Against protocol and despite concerns from her superiors, she moved Magnus into Luna's enclosure. The reunion was immediate and profound, with Magnus carefully examining every inch of Luna's healing body while she groomed the matted fur around his wounds. Within hours, Magnus was eating again. Within days, his strength began returning. The sight of the two bears together, Magnus's massive frame curled protectively around Luna's smaller form, became the image that defined their story for millions of followers worldwide. James's teenage daughter Emma had started volunteering at the center, drawn by a story that reminded her of her parents' love affair. "Dad," she said one evening as they watched Magnus and Luna through the observation window, "is this how you and Mom were? Like, would you have fought a python for her?" James felt his throat tighten. "Your mother fought cancer for 2 years, Em. And yeah, I'd have fought anything to keep her here with us. Just like Magnus fought for Luna." The political pressure reached a crescendo when Governor Patricia Hamilton announced a state review of wildlife spending priorities. "While we appreciate the public's emotional investment in this story," she stated during a press conference, "we must ask whether allocating hundreds of thousands of dollars to 2 bears represents responsible stewardship of taxpayer resources." Vincent Torres made his decision on a cold morning in early August. His daughter's condition had stabilized temporarily, but doctors warned that without the experimental treatment, she had perhaps months to live. He approached the Wildlife Center just after dawn, when only a skeleton crew was on duty, armed with tranquilizer equipment he'd acquired through old ranger contacts. Eleanor Whitman arrived for her volunteer shift to find Vincent's truck parked in the shadows behind the medical building. Something about the scene triggered her instincts. 35 years as a ranger's wife had taught her to recognize when situations felt wrong. "James," she said into her cell phone, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I think we've got trouble at the center. You need to get here now." Inside the recovery building, Vincent stood before Magnus and Luna's enclosure, the tranquilizer gun heavy in his hands. The bears sensed the threat immediately, Magnus positioning himself between Vincent and Luna, who moved protectively over her growing belly. For a long moment, the three stood frozen in a tableau of desperation, love, and impossible choices. "I'm sorry," Vincent whispered, his voice breaking. "I never wanted it to come to this, but she's my little girl, and I'm losing her." Magnus tilted his massive head, and in that gesture Vincent saw something that nearly broke his resolve, understanding, perhaps even forgiveness, from a creature who knew what it meant to love someone more than life itself. The tranquilizer gun trembled in Vincent Torres's hands as he stared into Magnus's dark eyes. Behind the great bear, Luna pressed herself against the back of their enclosure, her instincts screaming danger even as her pregnancy made her movements slower, more vulnerable. The morning light filtering through the medical center windows cast long shadows across the confrontation, and Vincent felt the weight of every desperate choice that had led him to this moment. "Please don't make me do this," Vincent whispered, his voice cracking under the strain. "Maria is only 10 years old. She asks me every day when she's going to get better, and I don't know what to tell her anymore." Magnus didn't retreat. Instead, he took a deliberate step forward, his massive frame filling the space between Vincent and Luna. The movement wasn't aggressive, it was resigned, almost sacrificial. In that gesture, Vincent saw the same desperate love that kept him awake at night, the same willingness to give everything for someone who mattered more than life itself. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if Eleanor Whitman hadn't chosen that moment to enter the building. Her weathered hands carried a thermos of coffee for the night staff, but she froze when she saw Vincent's silhouette against the bare enclosure. 35 years as a ranger's wife had taught her to read dangerous situations, and this one was explosive. "Vincent," she said softly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd talked down bears, angry tourists, and desperate men in equal measure. "Put the gun down, son. There's got to be another way." "You don't understand," Vincent replied without turning around. "The experimental treatment costs $200,000. Insurance won't cover it. I've mortgaged everything, sold everything. These bears are worth $500,000 on the black market. $500,000 that could save my daughter's life." Eleanor's heart clenched as she recognized the anguish in his voice. She'd buried her husband 10 years ago, watched him waste away from the same cancer that eventually took him. She understood the mathematics of desperation, the impossible equations parents solved when their children's lives hung in the balance. "Frank used to say that when you're drowning, you'll grab onto anything, even if it pulls someone else under," Eleanor said, taking a careful step closer. "But honey, this isn't the way. Magnus and Luna, they've got babies coming too. You can't save one family by destroying another." Behind them, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the morning air. James Mitchell had received Eleanor's call and responded with backup. But as the Ranger vehicle surrounded the building, the situation only grew more volatile. Vincent's finger moved closer to the trigger, and Magnus seemed to sense the escalation, his protective stance becoming more pronounced. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived moments later, her medical bag clutched in her hands as she assessed the scene. She'd lost count of the sleepless nights she'd spent caring for Luna, the hours she'd watched Magnus's devoted vigil. The thought of losing them now, like this, felt like losing her own children. "Vincent, listen to me," Dr. Chen called out, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I've been watching these bears for weeks. Magnus isn't just protecting Luna, he's protecting those cubs she's carrying. The first documented twin birth for Yellowstone grizzlies in over a decade. You're not just taking 2 bears. You're potentially ending a bloodline that could save the entire population." "And what about my bloodline?" Vincent shot back, his desperation finally boiling over. "What about Maria's future?" "Her children that she'll never have if she dies because I couldn't afford to save her?" The emotional standoff reached its breaking point when Luna, stressed by the human voices and Magnus's defensive posture, began showing signs of distress. Her breathing became labored, and Dr. Chen recognized the early warning signs of premature labor, a catastrophic development that could kill both mother and cubs. "She's going into labor," Dr. Chen announced, her professional training overriding the fear. "Vincent, if you don't let me get to her right now, you're going to watch 3 bears die instead of saving one little girl." The words hit Vincent like a physical blow. He'd become a ranger because he believed in protecting life, in preserving the wild spaces that made Montana beautiful. Now he stood poised to destroy the very thing he'd once sworn to protect. And for what? Money that might not even save Maria, a black market transaction that would make him everything he'd once stood against. Magnus made the decision for everyone. As Luna's distressed vocalizations filled the air, the massive grizzly turned his back on Vincent and moved to his mate's side. The gesture was both surrender and statement. He was choosing love over fear, trust over survival instinct. In that moment, Vincent saw himself reflected in the bear's choice, and the tranquilizer gun slipped from his shaking hands. "I can't," Vincent sobbed, sinking to his knees. "God help me, I can't do this to them." Dr. Chen rushed past him into the enclosure, her medical training taking over as she assessed Luna's condition. The contractions were irregular but concerning, brought on by stress rather than natural timing. Magnus positioned himself to support Luna's weight, somehow understanding that his mate needed stability more than protection now. "James, I need an ambulance for Luna and a sedative for Vincent," Dr. Chen called out, her hands already working to calm Luna's breathing. "And someone call the media. If we're going to save these bears and help Vincent's daughter, We need the whole world to see what's happening here." Eleanor knelt beside Vincent, her weathered hands placing gentle pressure on his shoulders. "Frank used to say that sometimes the Lord puts us in impossible situations to teach us about miracles," she said softly. "Maybe this is one of those times." The next few hours unfolded like a carefully choreographed crisis. Luna's labor stabilized under Dr. Chen's care, but she remained at risk for premature delivery. Magnus never left her side, his massive frame serving as both comfort and shield. Vincent was taken into custody but not charged, pending evaluation of his mental state and circumstances. The story exploded across social media within hours. Videos of Vincent's breakdown, Magnus's protective stance, and Luna's medical crisis created a perfect storm of human emotion and animal drama. The hashtag #save Magnus Luna and Maria began trending worldwide, linking the Bear family's crisis to Vincent's dying daughter in a narrative that transcended species boundaries. Celebrity supporters began donating substantial amounts. Talk show hosts dedicated segments to the story. Children emptied piggy banks and held lemonade stands. But perhaps most importantly, Dr. Patricia Williams at Denver Children's Hospital announced that Maria Torres would receive the experimental treatment free of charge, funded by the same emotional wave that had carried Magnus and Luna into the national consciousness. As evening fell over the Wildlife Center, Magnus and Luna rested together in their enclosure. Her labor pains subsided, but her pregnancy now considered high risk. Vincent sat in the county jail, his heart lighter despite his circumstances, knowing that his daughter would live. Eleanor maintained her vigil in the observation room, her coffee long cold as she watched the bears and thought about the mysterious ways that love creates families, crosses species, and saves lives when all hope seems lost. The darkest hour came 3 days after Vincent's breakdown, when Eleanor Whitman collapsed in the Wildlife Center's observation room. She'd been maintaining her vigil beside Magnus and Luna, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, when the massive heart attack struck without warning. James Mitchell found her slumped in her chair, her eyes still fixed on the bears she'd grown to love like family. "Call 911!" James shouted to Dr. Chen, who was checking Luna's vital signs in the adjacent room. But even as the paramedics worked over Eleanor's still form, everyone knew they were losing the woman who had become the emotional heart of their makeshift family. Magnus seemed to sense the crisis unfolding beyond his enclosure, his massive head lifting as Eleanor's body was wheeled past on a stretcher. Eleanor passed away peacefully at Billings General Hospital that evening, surrounded by the Wildlife Center staff who had become her chosen family. Her last words, whispered to James as he held her hand, were about Magnus and Luna. "Promise me you'll see them through this. Frank would have wanted that." The loss devastated everyone who had been following the bear's story. Eleanor had become the grandmother figure that millions of viewers had adopted through social media, her daily updates and gentle wisdom providing the human heart to an extraordinary animal story. Her death felt personal to people who had never met her, a reminder that love and loss were universal experiences that transcended species. But Eleanor's passing was only the beginning of a cascade of tragedies that would test everyone's faith. Dr. Chen, overwhelmed by grief and the pressure of caring for high-risk patients, suffered a severe panic attack during Luna's routine examination. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she tried to monitor the pregnant bear's condition, and the realization that she could no longer provide adequate care sent her into a spiral of professional and personal crisis. "I can't do this anymore," Dr. Chen confessed to James through tears, her medical bag trembling in her hands. "Every time I look at Luna, I see all the children I never had, all the families I couldn't save. Eleanor believed in me, and I've failed everyone. Her breakdown came at the worst possible time. Luna had begun showing signs of distress again, her pregnancy complicated by the trauma of recent weeks. Without Dr. Chen's expertise, the Wildlife Center lacked the specialized knowledge needed to manage a high-risk grizzly pregnancy. The nearest comparable veterinarian was in Colorado, and Luna was too fragile to transport. Magnus seemed to understand that the humans around him were struggling. His behavior became increasingly protective, not just of Luna but of the entire medical staff. When replacement veterinarians arrived to assess Luna's condition, Magnus positioned himself as a gentle barrier, allowing access but maintaining watchful supervision. It was as if he recognized that his human allies were wounded and needed protection too. The financial crisis deepened when Governor Hamilton announced a state audit of all wildlife spending. Eleanor's death had eliminated their most passionate advocate, and public opinion began shifting as critics questioned the enormous costs associated with keeping 2 bears alive. "We've spent over $300,000 on animals while children in our state lack basic health care," the governor declared during a press conference that felt like a political execution. The breaking point came when Luna went into premature labor at 32 weeks gestation. Dr. Chen, despite her emotional fragility, rushed back to the center when she received the emergency call. She found Luna in active labor with Magnus frantically pacing around her, his vocalizations filled with distress that mirrored the human's panic. "The first cub isn't breathing," Dr. Chen announced after the difficult delivery, her voice breaking as she worked desperately to resuscitate the tiny form. Despite 20 minutes of intensive effort, the smallest cub, a female weighing barely 2 pounds, couldn't be saved. Luna's mournful cries as she nuzzled her lifeless offspring created a sound that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Magnus's grief was overwhelming to witness. The massive bear, who had shown such strength and courage throughout their ordeal, seemed to shrink into himself as he processed the loss. He refused to leave the stillborn cub's side, his massive paw gently touching the tiny form while his eyes conveyed a depth of sorrow that transcended language. "Animals grieve just like we do," James said quietly, watching Magnus's vigil through the observation window. "Sometimes I think they feel it even deeper because they can't rationalize it away." The surviving cub, a male, was weak but breathing. Luna's maternal instincts, however, seemed broken by the trauma of losing one baby. She showed little interest in nursing the survivor, her depression mirroring Magnus's as the small family struggled with their loss. Dr. Chen found herself hand-feeding the cub around the clock, her own maternal instincts finally finding purpose in the tiny life that depended entirely on human intervention. Public sentiment, which had been overwhelmingly supportive, began to fracture in the face of such visible suffering. Animal rights activists argued that keeping the bears in captivity was causing more harm than good, while supporters maintained that abandoning them now would make Eleanor's sacrifice meaningless. The debate raged on social media and news programs, with everyone seeming to have an opinion about what was best for Magnus and Luna. Vincent Torres, still in county jail but following the story through news reports, felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on him. His daughter Maria, now receiving her life-saving treatment, asked daily about the bears she'd heard so much about. "Daddy, are Magnus and Luna going to be okay?" she would ask during their phone calls, and Vincent found himself unable to answer. The Wildlife Center faced its darkest decision yet. With Eleanor gone, Dr. Chen compromised and public support wavering, the board of directors called an emergency meeting to discuss the possibility of transferring Magnus and Luna to a zoo facility where they could receive long-term care without the enormous costs. It felt like abandoning family, but the financial reality was undeniable. Magnus seemed to sense the discussions happening around him. His protective behavior intensified, and he began showing signs of the stress that had nearly killed him during Luna's surgery. The sight of the magnificent bear slowly wasting away from anxiety while his mate struggled with depression created a perfect storm of heartbreak that tested everyone's resolve. As autumn approached, with Eleanor's memorial service planned and the future of Magnus and Luna hanging in the balance, it seemed that love alone might not be enough to save the family that had captured the world's attention. The first revelation came buried in Eleanor Whitman's personal papers, discovered by her estranged son Michael when he arrived from Seattle to settle her estate. Michael had been prepared for the usual detritus of a long life. Old photographs, outdated appliances, and the accumulated possessions of a woman who had lived alone for too long. What he found instead, in a cedar chest beneath his father's old ranger uniform, changed everything. "I don't understand," Michael said to James Mitchell, his voice shaking as he held up a manila folder thick with veterinary records. "These documents say my father treated a bear cub named Magnus in 2015. But that's impossible. Dad retired in 2010. James examined the papers with growing amazement. Frank Whitman hadn't retired. He'd taken a consulting position with a wildlife rehabilitation program, specializing in orphaned bear cubs. The record showed months of careful documentation about a 6-month-old grizzly cub whose mother had been killed by poachers. Frank had personally overseen Magnus's early care before his release into Yellowstone's western quadrant. "Your mother knew," James realized, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. "That's why she was so devoted to Magnus. She wasn't just volunteering, she was watching over Frank's greatest success story." The second bombshell came from Dr. Chen's careful examination of Magnus's old medical records. Cross-referencing the dates with Luna's known movements, she made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the conservation community. Magnus and Luna weren't just any mated pair. They represented the last breeding hope for a genetically distinct population of Yellowstone grizzlies that had been thought extinct. "Look at these DNA markers," Dr. Chen explained to the emergency board meeting, her earlier depression replaced by scientific excitement. "Magnus carries genes from the original Yellowstone population that we lost in the 1970s. Luna's lineage traces back to the Glacier National Park reintroduction program. Their cubs represent the first successful genetic merger between these populations in over 50 years. The implications were staggering. What had seemed like an expensive emotional indulgence was actually a critical conservation breakthrough. The surviving cub carried genetic diversity that could strengthen the entire Yellowstone grizzly population for generations to come. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Vincent Torres, during his psychological evaluation in county jail, finally revealed the truth about why he'd been tracking Magnus and Luna. He hadn't been planning to sell them to black market collectors. He'd been investigating reports of illegal poaching operations that were targeting genetically valuable bears. "I've been working undercover for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for 6 months, Vincent confessed to federal investigators. "We suspected someone was selling breeding pairs to private collectors overseas. Magnus and Luna were never the target. They were the bait." The real criminals were revealed to be a sophisticated network that included corrupt wildlife officials, international smugglers, and wealthy collectors who saw rare animals as living trophies. Vincent's former supervisor at the Park Service, Regional Director Carl Morrison, had been feeding information to poachers about the most valuable animals in the system. "The python attack wasn't random," Vincent explained during a recorded statement that would later be used in federal court. "Morrison's people released that snake specifically to disable Luna so they could capture both bears. I got there just minutes too late to prevent it." The revelation that the entire crisis had been orchestrated by humans made Magnus's heroic rescue even more remarkable. Not only had he saved Luna from immediate death, but he'd unknowingly disrupted a criminal operation that threatened dozens of endangered animals across the western United States. Eleanor's will provided the final twist that no one saw coming. Michael Whitman stood in the Wildlife Center's conference room, reading from his mother's handwritten testament with tears streaming down his face. His mother had left her entire estate, valued at over $2 million, not to her children, but to the establishment of the Eleanor and Frank Whitman Wildlife Conservation Foundation. The foundation's sole purpose, Michael read aloud, is to provide lifetime care for Magnus, Luna, and their offspring, and to support the conservation of genetically significant wildlife populations. Eleanor had anticipated every possible crisis, every financial obstacle, every bureaucratic challenge that might threaten the bear's future. But perhaps more importantly, the will revealed Eleanor's deep understanding of her family's neglect. "I have lived 10 years of loneliness since Frank's death," she had written. "Not because I lacked love to give, but because my children were too busy with their own lives to receive it. Magnus and Luna reminded me that family isn't defined by blood or obligation, but by the choice to show up when someone needs you most." The impact on Michael was immediate and devastating. He'd spent the last decade minimizing contact with his mother, sending obligatory Christmas cards and brief phone calls while building his successful tech company in Seattle. Now he understood that his mother had found the family she needed in the most unlikely place, a wildlife rehabilitation center filled with wounded animals and dedicated caregivers. Dr. Chen's recovery from her emotional breakdown accelerated dramatically when she realized the true significance of her work. The woman who had grieved for the children she'd never had discovered that she'd been nurturing something even more precious, the future of an entire species. The surviving cub, now thriving under her intensive care, represented hope not just for Magnus and Luna, but for every grizzly bear in North America. "I've been thinking about this all wrong," she confided to James during one of their late-night vigils. "I kept mourning the babies I never had, instead of celebrating the thousands of lives I've helped save. Magnus and Luna didn't just find each other. They found me when I needed purpose most." The federal investigation that followed Vincent's revelations led to arrests across 3 states and the recovery of over 40 endangered animals from illegal captivity. Carl Morrison was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, while the international smuggling network was dismantled in a coordinated operation involving law enforcement agencies from 6 countries. Vincent Torres was not only cleared of all charges, but offered a position as a federal wildlife investigator, his undercover work having provided crucial evidence for the prosecution. His daughter Maria, now in remission thanks to the experimental treatment funded by public donations, became the unofficial mascot of the new foundation, visiting Magnus and Luna regularly and documenting their progress for the foundation's educational programs. The scientific community embraced the genetic revelation with unprecedented enthusiasm. Research institutions lined up to study Magnus and Luna's offspring, offering millions in funding for conservation programs based on their unique genetics. What had begun as a local wildlife rescue had evolved into an international conservation effort with implications for endangered species worldwide. Magnus seemed to sense that the crisis had passed. His behavior gradually returned to the protective but calm demeanor that had first captured public attention. Luna, bonding successfully with her surviving cub, began showing interest in her surroundings again. The small family that had endured so much trauma was finally beginning to heal. As autumn painted the Montana landscape in brilliant colors, the Wildlife Center buzzed with new energy and purpose. Eleanor's foundation provided not just financial security, but a sense of mission that transcended the immediate needs of 2 bears and their cub. The facility expanded its programs, hired additional staff, and became a model for wildlife conservation centers across the nation. The truth about Magnus and Luna's significance had transformed them from expensive charity cases into invaluable conservation assets. But more importantly, it had revealed the profound connections that exist between human and animal families when love transcends species boundaries. 3 months later, the first snow of winter dusted the mountains surrounding Yellowstone. As Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the observation window of the Eleanor and Frank Whitman Wildlife Conservation Foundation. The new facility, built with Eleanor's bequest and ongoing donations, represented everything the elderly woman had dreamed of, a place where wild animals could heal while maintaining their essential wildness. Magnus and Luna had thrived in their expanded habitat, a carefully designed enclosure that mimicked natural conditions while allowing for medical monitoring. Their surviving cub, now named Franklin in honor of Eleanor's late husband, had grown into a healthy, playful youngster who delighted visitors with his curious nature and obvious intelligence. Luna's maternal instincts had fully returned, and she doted on Franklin with the fierce protectiveness that had first made her famous. "Look at them," whispered Michael Whitman, Eleanor's son, who had relocated from Seattle to serve as the foundation's executive director. "Mom would have loved seeing this." Indeed, the scene before them was one of perfect contentment. Magnus lay in a patch of autumn sunlight, his massive frame relaxed as Franklin tumbled over his father's back in an endless game of bear-cub antics. Luna watched from nearby, occasionally chuffing gentle corrections when Franklin's play became too boisterous. It was the picture of a family at peace. Dr. Chen had found her calling in ways she'd never imagined possible. The Foundation's research program, built around Magnus and Luna's unique genetics, had attracted international attention and funding. More importantly, she discovered that healing animals had always been her way of nurturing the maternal instincts she'd thought were forever unfulfilled. The genetic analysis came back from the university, she announced to the gathered staff. "Luna is pregnant again, twins, just like before. But this time, everything looks perfect." The news brought tears of joy to eyes that had seen too much sorrow. James Mitchell, now the Foundation's Director of Field Operations, felt his throat tighten with emotion. The second chance that Magnus and Luna had earned felt like a gift, not just to them, but to everyone who had fought to keep their family together. Vincent Torres arrived that afternoon with his daughter Mariah, now a healthy 11-year-old whose fascination with bears had led her to volunteer at the Foundation every weekend. The man who had once held a tranquilizer gun on Magnus now served as a federal wildlife investigator, his undercover work having saved countless animals from illegal trafficking. "Uncle Magnus?" Maria called out, using the nickname she'd given the great bear months ago. Magnus actually raised his head at the sound of her voice, something that continued to amaze the scientific staff. The bond between the girl and the bear family had become one of the Foundation's most treasured relationships. "Dad, can I tell them about my science project?" Maria asked, her eyes bright with excitement. Vincent nodded, his heart full as he watched his daughter, alive, healthy, and passionate about conservation, approach the habitat with complete confidence. Eleanor's legacy lived on in ways both practical and profound. Her foundation provided permanent homes for dozens of rescued animals, while her written journals, discovered after her death, had been published as a book about finding family in unexpected places. The royalties supported wildlife programs across the nation, ensuring that her impact would continue for generations. The Foundation's success had drawn attention from around the world. Delegations of conservationists visited regularly, studying the integration of rescue work, research, and education that had evolved from Eleanor's simple desire to help two bears in love. Magnus and Luna had become ambassadors for their species, proving that with proper care and respect, Wild animals could thrive alongside human civilization. James often thought about his late wife Sarah during his evening rounds. She would have loved seeing how love between Magnus and Luna, between Eleanor and her chosen family of animals and caregivers, between all the humans who had rallied to support an impossible dream, had created something beautiful and lasting. As winter settled over Montana, the foundation buzzed with preparations for Luna's second pregnancy. This time, there was no financial crisis, no political pressure, no desperate choices to be made. Eleanor's careful planning had provided security and stability that would last for decades. Dr. Chen stood in the memorial garden that had been planted in Eleanor's honor, watching Magnus and Luna through the window as snow began to fall more heavily. Franklin pressed against his mother's side while Magnus positioned himself as windbreak against the weather, the same protective instinct that had first brought him to national attention. "Thank you, Eleanor," Dr. Chen whispered to the bronze plaque that bore the elderly woman's gentle smile. "You showed us all what it means to choose love over fear." As darkness fell over the foundation, the bears settled in for the night, a family complete, safe, and surrounded by humans who understood that sometimes the most important conservation work happens not in distant wilderness, but in the space between species where love transcends all boundaries. In the end, Magnus and Luna's story had become exactly what Eleanor always knew it could be. Proof that when we choose to protect love, wherever we find it, we protect the best parts of ourselves as well. Sometimes the most profound love stories don't happen between humans. Magnus and Luna's journey reminds us that loyalty, sacrifice, and unwavering devotion transcend species, and perhaps teach us something we've forgotten about what it means to truly show up for someone we love. In a world where families scatter across continents and nursing homes feel like warehouses for forgotten dreams, these two bears chose each other daily, through crisis and recovery, through loss and hope. Eleanor Whitman, at 72, found her greatest purpose not in the children who rarely called, but in protecting a love that asked for nothing but presence. She discovered what many of us learned too late. Family isn't about blood or obligation, but about the choice to stay when staying is hard. Dr. Chen spent years mourning the children she never had, until she realized she'd been nurturing thousands of lives that mattered just as much. Their story challenges us to ask, when did we stop believing in the kind of love that fights pythons, mortgages houses, and changes laws? When did we decide that practicality matters more than devotion? Magnus never calculated the cost of saving Luna. He simply loved her enough to risk everything. What relationship in your life deserves the kind of loyalty Magnus showed Luna? Have you ever experienced or witnessed love that asked for nothing but gave everything? Share your story in the comments below.